Welcome to this session on literary criticism, where we would look into some of the practical applications of feminist criticism done by Maggie Hum. Feminism relates to divergent ideas that share three major notions, namely gender as a social construct which oppresses women, patriarchy that is held responsible for this construction, and women's experiential knowledge as a basis for a non-sexist society in the future. Contemporary women's experiences of sexuality, career and family challenge traditional notions and studies related to feminism. Maggie Hum asserts that the dual task of feminism is to attack gender stereotypes and announce the construction of new roles. Without the task of construction, feminism has no goal. Maggie Hum explains that although feminism is a global phenomenon, it takes into account four specific features. First, deliberations on areas related to reproduction, representation and sexual division of labor. Second, feminism as a political activity as practiced in most countries of the world and which has emerged as an interdisciplinary field of study. Third, inclusion of concepts such as sexism and sexual harassment to encourage discussions on social discrimination. And the fourth, sharing of women's subjective and objective experiences in creating knowledge. The starting point in discussions related to feminism is the consciousness that the personal can become political. Literature contributes to the social perception of the gender inequalities, and women become feminists by becoming conscious of and criticizing the power of symbolic misrepresentations of women. Let's look into the structure of the book. The practices of feminist literary criticism are explained, with each chapter beginning with the description of divergent approaches that focus on main themes and critiques, followed by an example of how to apply the chosen approach to an individual text. Select excerpts from books considered for analysis can reveal the theories used to explain them. The chapters in the book include discussions on second wave feminism, myth criticism, Marxist or socialist criticism, French feminism, psychoanalytic criticism, post-structuralism, deconstruction, postmodernism, black feminisms, lesbian criticism and third world feminisms. This session will discuss select passages from the fiction of different authors and analyze the application of second wave feminism, myth criticism and Marxist or socialist criticism to the passages separately. The discussion on the passages would be concise. We begin with second wave feminism. Second wave feminism, which gained grounds in the latter half of the 20th century, questioned authority and shifted its focus to marginalized groups and their political engagements. Discussions were centered primarily on self-realization for women as a collective, as a definite challenge to feminine mystique. Black power writing, the French New Novel and feminist fiction gained importance. It insisted that literature plays a crucial role in drawing attention to political concerns and radical movements. Contemporary women's novels provide new meanings of gender identity, along with new forms of cultural and critical thought such as existentialism and structuralism. Second wave feminism too tended to subvert the establishment. This movement also played a role in helping historical agency and representations of sexual politics to be included in traditional criticism. Second wave feminists questioned why women are represented as the other in books written by men, and the reason why most women characters are stereotypical representations. They also raised questions about how the author's conception of the world would contribute to the shaping of his literary works by involving sociology, history, and cultural studies. Critics argued that literature symbolized patriarchal fears and beliefs and acted as a major tool of socialization. A crucial factor of the second wave criticism is gender discrimination and inequalities that originate from individual psyche rather than socially inscribed roles. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, published in 1949, followed by Kate Millett's Sexual Politics in 1970, questioned the cultural and ethical values inherent in literary representation. Analyzing the works of D.H. Lawrence and other male modernists, Beauvoir and Millett drew attention to the ways in which the greater social power that men have over women are translated into textual conventions. Second wave critics questioned the idealism of literary works and explained how literature exhibited the cultural ideology of society. Critics drew attention to unrecognized women writers and decided to publish texts by lost or unrepresented women authors. Second wave critics assumed that women's experience mattered in real life and literature. Powerful textual representation of women's experiences in literature challenged patriarchy by creating new role models and patterns of living. Special attention was given to the autobiographical novel, since the authors or characters growing into consciousness and the process of looking back on the experiences in their lives might offer valuable insights for contemporary readers. The best examples are Kate Chopin's The Awakening and Agnes Smedley's Daughter of Earth. Autobiographical novels usually describe an individual's journey to selfhood and are also known as Bildungsroman. These journeys shared experiences of sexual abuse, reproductive difficulties, and social discriminations. In Daughter of Earth, the author explains how social and economic forces, individual morality, and development are interconnected. The novel traces the growth of the strong female protagonist who emerges successful despite social and psychological constraints in rural life in America that leads to her self-development. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics in 1970 inaugurated debates about gender and representation, considered pivotal for second wave feminism. Sexual politics was thought to be free from gender descriptions, and the ideological projection of a masculine point of view was explored. Kate Millett and Germaine Greer argued that literary history included texts written by great men and formed the literary canon because literature was dominated by men. Literary history would therefore represent women unequally rather than reflect the reality of women's experience of life. Feminists hoped to denounce negative images of women and provide an adequate account of women's roles in literature and culture. Second wave feminism involved rereading, resistance, and revision of works by single authors and works belonging to literary history or particular genres. This means that literary texts were thought to reflect as well as create imbalances between men and women. Kate Millett's Sexual Politics argues that patriarchal power is responsible for women's subordination and their unequal status in society. There is a deeply formed politics of sexuality, starting with the perpetration of patriarchy through psychological conditioning in the family that operates within economic and cultural structures. Millett's argument is that literature also contributes to the ideological indoctrination that is the root of women's oppression. Millett attacked male writers such as D.H. Lawrence, Henry Miller, and Norman Mailer by questioning misogynistic passages from their texts and proposing that a patriarchal sexual politics was evident in their works. Millett made three major charges in sexual politics. First, male authors create stereotypical female characters. Second, misrepresentations work through association. And third, the narrative structure of fiction in some way resembles the other cultural structures of patriarchy. Let us now move on to analysis of Agnes Smedley's Daughter of Earth and Robert Lowell's Notebook. Daughter of Earth details accounts of women's subjugation at various levels, particularly patriarchy and its stronghold over the lives of women and other marginalized sections in the society. The depiction of healthy, strong and collective women's bonding by Smedley provides an alternate picture to male oppressions. Several female characters narrate instances of sexual abuse and miserable lives as prostitutes. However, they emerge strong enough to control their lives. Daughter of Earth describes the day-to-day activities of women. Concomitantly, the focus is on collective friendship as opposed to drudgery or sentimentalism. Smedley's themes propagate second-wave feminist love of women-centered texts. The passages by Smedley could be considered to project feminine fantasies of cheap romance. However, the most relevant point is that the passages reverse male gaze to deny subjectivity to the male protagonist Newt, while involving the reader with Marie's embodied point of view. According to Hum, the passage is recognized to be a powerful textual interpellation of a female reader. Hum defines interpellation as the process by which writing attracts a reader into participating in the text by the deployment of characterization, symbols, plot structure, and so forth. Romances usually interpellate a female reader by using strong female heroes and happy endings. Textually, romances have greater reader identification with heterosexuality through descriptions of the male gaze and suppressed violence. Marie's individualism, which is achieved through interrogation of the stereotypical notions of the female role and romance, is given importance. She moves forward towards freedom from responsibilities of family and recognizes her sexual awakening to be significant. Marie focuses on the gap between institutions such as marriage and motherhood and individual feelings. She realizes that female sexuality is socially constructed as prostitute, wife, and mother, through which the overtly proclaimed sexual pleasures are brought out. The juxtaposition of private psychic needs and public languages of sexualities is confusing. However, the movement from the inner recesses to public interrogative might mar a female reader's own feelings about her dislocated roles. Second-wave feminists recognize independent thinking and not romance and focus on literary representations of women's social oppressions and social victories as well as liberating attitudes. In contrast, the poem by Lowell analyzes a masculine perception of sexuality. The American poet Robert Lowell is an autobiographical poet whose poems have often been recognized as quests for self-discovery. For this reason, Lowell's poem Notebook could be read from the second-wave perspective as reflections of the author's beliefs. Lowell uses the intimate voice of the interior monologue to negotiate sexual experiences. Lowell's contemporary life history, in which he was experiencing many difficult relationships with his wife, lovers, and daughter Harriet, is important for second-wave comments. The poem describes a poet reflecting on his masculinity while balancing sexually private and public moments. The subject of the poem is a turn inwards, a look at the differences in masculine representations at different times in his life. As second wave critics point out, the process of repression of sexuality permeates Lowell's desires into the objectified setting of his adolescence. Lowell's objectification of sexual violence, his feelings and past moments project that heterosexuality is a root cause of patriarchal oppression. Lowell's poem is a good example to show how patriarchal sexual politics shapes poetic form. The belief in the universal feature of patriarchy is contested along with the practice of bringing together author and text. After the discussion on second wave feminism, we move on to discuss myth criticism. Feminist myth criticism seeks to read utopian texts against the grain of contemporary culture. Conventional myths appear to act against women with Greek stories that provide ample examples like the angry male god as Zeus and Apollo, and deceitful goddesses as Helen, or women known only for their support of men like Penelope. Judeo-Christian myths typify women as temptresses or passive holy figures. Feminist critics argue that Greek or Roman myths reflect the anxieties of male psyches because the narratives are male constructs. Feminist myth critics are engaged in female mythologies and they reject the contemporary and patriarchal preoccupation with Greek myths and heroes. Mary Daly in Gin or Ecology describes the worlds of nature and prehistory which Christianity has overlooked. According to feminists, myth criticism tries to recover powerful images associated with the feminine that is found in Aboriginal Australian culture. Private or public myths that often feature dreams and forbidden personal feelings. Myths center on eternal or human truths which claim to be valid in any society or historical context. Black women writers such as Alice Walker and Audre Lorde rely on African myths to focus on matrilineal diasporas that work to project the relationship of mothers and daughters. The Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa draws on the Mexican serpent and nature myths to reclaim a mythical identity not influenced by racist society. However, the most important point is that myths are primarily about power and gender. In the essay, What Can a Heroine Do? Or Why Women Can't Write, Jonna Russ attacks the canon for its omissions and distortions of female productivity and primacy of positive masculine mythological constructions. The aim of feminist myth critics is to condemn traditional gender archetypes and reassess other mythical representations to offer divergent narrative images. Challenging gender stereotypes often raises questions about realism. However, myths are also created by writers to function as a psychological study of the characters. Fictional representation of myths depicts imaginary and symbolic forms of social processes that affect women. Myths are generally linked to real history. Classic myth stories dwell upon the quest for identity or the search for a parent figure where the central aim is to account for individual development. The employment of imagery and particular vocabulary render myths into quest events. However, the mark of patriarchy is repeated through several paradigms of mythical representations. Feminist myth critics describe distinctive and alternative myths by using certain techniques. Symbols that employ myth reveal a writer's psychological state that helps the reader to understand particular psychological images and dreams. Let's move on to the analysis of Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness and Margaret Atwood's Surfacing. Le Guin challenges traditional myth archetypes in The Left Hand of Darkness by referring to a future world Gethin, permanently wrapped in winter and inhabited by androgynous people who change to the feminine gender at cyclical moments called kima in order to reproduce. The entry of the heterosexual male envoy I, representing the League of All Worlds, marks the beginning of the novel. I stays in Gethin and emphasizes his concrete perceptions of the world and its structures of meaning, since he is a historian of an unrecorded world. Feminist myth critics typically focus on writers' strategies of defamiliarization, the technique science fiction writers commonly use to subvert the messages of traditional myth. Le Guin employs an unheroic figure as I, who has to depend on Estravan in order to survive. The key concern of feminist myth critics is to celebrate the communal features of women's stories rather than any traditional hierarchical formulae where stories are transmitted from the prophet to his progeny. The quality of I is a drawback when he is unable to complete the journey across the ice without the help of Estravan, and his journey is considered to be a conventional metaphor of spiritual progress. I is a fluid character whose certainties are constantly under threat in the Gethin world, which he never fully understands. The novel challenges the idea of an intact, confident vision of the world and contrasts this with forms of thinking and consciousness raising which are communal. I chooses the ecological wisdom of the foretellers over the military barbarianism of the city. Unlike I, in The Left Hand of Darkness, the female narrator in Atwood's Surfacing uses myth to unravel certain untold aspects of her life and simultaneously privileges the female mythic relics to the male ones. In Surfacing, a young woman searches for her missing father as well as her internal search for her memories of her dead mother. In this sense, the novel holds a classic myth structure. The novel asks questions about paternity or maternity, language and identity. By rewriting the myth of a questing hero, Atwood attempts to revive the social stereotypes of female identity by giving significance to maternal relations to counter the usual devaluation of such characters in classical myth. The narrator leaves her city home in search for clues of her father's disappearance. Returning to her distant childhood island home, the narrator gathers memories of her father and mother who died some years earlier, along with recovered childhood objects and pictographs left by her father. Using mythology, the narrator finds the body of her father, who had drowned in a lake while taking photographs of underwater Native American cave paintings. Atwood links masculine totems and female myth imagery. Men's misuse and women's use of nature in Surfacing is specifically elaborated to provide a gender perspective to the novel. Atwood associates women with fertility and men with environmental abuse, specifically as a metaphor of the violation of women by men. The narrator understands shamanism to be a practice that would provide her the ability to unravel the mysteries behind her parents' interest in native cultures. Shamans are spiritual people who traverse from human shape into animals, plants and sky in order to return with reclaimed natural powers. The attribution of shamanism to women is problematic because in several cultures, women are not thought to be spiritually inclined. Shamanism expresses several feminist mythic themes. The concern with spirituality affirms feminine features such as intuition, and interest in imagery often associated with the feminine, such as water and matriarchal imagery. The narrator identifies women with ecology and holism in opposition to male hunters and meat eaters. She learns to possess myth and identify her parents with Native American totems in her visions because she has a concern for ecological survival. Food rituals are frequent and important mythical motifs in the novel. Preordained food is permitted, while the food in the cabin is forbidden. Her food should consist of the primary colors, for they are considered good for health. The protagonist is presented as an effective and active agent rather than a receiving being. This form of relation between person and object is common in religious rituals. Specific animal metaphors like the dinosaur are used as a source of knowledge where the individual comes to know himself. Shamanism encourages humans to adopt the potencies of animal shape, even outwardly transforming their physical human shapes into other forms. Atwood describes the different forms of fluids such as water, rain and floating to express abstract ideas. Myth critics are also attracted to the concept of the transcendental, where concrete objects or natural features are used as symbols to represent an ideal world. Light as an example that creates the perception called dermoptic perception or skin vision, by which shamans can detect colors without actually perceiving them, and colored light gives a kind of psychic protection. The symbols of shamanism, water, light and totems are signs of female power. The protagonist does not respect the totems from her father, which she describes as complicated and tangled, but respects the maternal totems, her mother's pictographs. These pictographs are fluid and open-ended, unlike the meanings transmitted in literate cultures, which are fixed and given. The placing of the feminine within a spiritual sign system helps Atwood escape from conservative association of women and nature. Myths are structural devices or ways of organizing female reality. Surfacing uses its mythic structure self-consciously to explore issues of feminist ethics and provide a viable narrative of self-identity. With this, we move on to Marxist or socialist criticism. Marxist or socialist feminist criticism examines influence of social and political values derived from class and patriarchal exploitation. Marxist or socialist feminism places particular emphasis on the ideologies overtly depicted or suggested by textual features. Ideas about sexist social divisions of a society or sexist ideologies regarding women's domestic places are criticized by feminists because they depict a situation where women have no freedom. Gendered differences are crucial to Marxist theory. Hence, prevalent ideology is depicted to propagate women's inferiority. Marxist or socialist feminists seldom describe textual features in terms of the author's personal political beliefs. A text can accurately describe a society's particular social division. However, the author may be patriarchal. These feminists are interested in portraying how literature interacts with other cultural forms, understands readers to be social beings, and how, in turn, literature is shaped by its own production processes. The primary objective of Marxist or socialist feminists is to analyze the arrangements of intertextual relationships, because textual choices in relation to specific social and historical processes may be unconscious or incoherent. The critics disengage from a traditional Marxist subordination of literary and cultural superstructure and set out to determine the economic and social structures. Marxist socialist feminists argue that sexual ideologies are not always functional because patriarchal ideologies often work against the best interest of capitalism. The interaction between cultural representations and social mechanisms of human oppression is a concern of all strands of feminist criticism as much as the shaping of cultural representations by material practices is a concern of the traditional Marxist. Marxist feminists consider gender constructions to be a contested site. Literature consists of forms, values and images that contribute to social and gender relationships. Discussion of representations in which authors and readers negotiate ideas of gender and society is particular to Marxist or socialist feminism. History and historical representations for literary values and meanings are important to every society. Traditional Marxist critics pay attention to the ways in which the situations of female character derived from a distinct set of historical and social dynamics define her inferior social and political status. Distinct gender roles such as those of marriage and motherhood are described in terms of class issues than in accordance with women's patriarchal subordination. Marxist theory addresses social conditions and different forms of exploitation and expresses how writers consciously or unconsciously transpose these issues into literature. Feminism considers the psyche of the individual, the subject in interaction and social formations to provide a greater understanding of the gendered subjectivity of political and historical representations and events. The four structures of capitalist patriarchy, namely reproduction, production, socialization of children and sexuality are interdependent. Women's liberation could be achieved only if all these four structures are radically transformed. The end of patriarchy would therefore need a cultural and social revolution. With this background, let's move on to the analysis of Thomas Hardy's Test of the D'Urbervilles and Sylvia Townsend Warner's Somerville Show. Test of the D'Urbervilles accurately portrays the changes in 19th century sexual politics. The women's movement ushered a fresh dimension into gender roles, and this crisis is a major feature in the concept of new women, including those by Thomas Hardy. The novel informs about contemporary and religious and social values that deform women's economic roles and social possibilities. Tess is projected to perform rather than inhabit male constructs, siren, protester and commodity, but gradually discards those representations to gain her own womanhood by the end of the novel. Her thoughts are not socially constructed, but work against other constructions in the narrative, including those of gender. Her thoughts are not determined by physical appearance, but by feminine qualities whereby she distances herself from her body. Tess' independent, monologic assertions are direct and have structurally more significance than masculine representations. She is not a stereotype of the fair dairymaid, but a proletarian worker forced to sell her labor in the winter when dairy work is unavailable. The displacement of agricultural workers and Tess' struggle with identity are shaped by the struggle represented by the ambiguities of narrative point of view. The fragmentation of point of view, the multi-generic form of the novel, and the dialectical juxtaposition of gender representation are important centers for Marxist or socialist feminism. Somerville Show portrays realism and class exploitation more than gender contradictions. One of the questions for Marxist or social feminists is to inquire how to utilize traditional Marxist paradigms to understand women's representations. Marxist feminists analyze how historical contexts produce literature and in turn is influenced by literature. The Paris Revolution of 1848 provides a background to the novel. The women characters in the novel are thinkers and free spirits. One of the main themes in the novel is the subjection of women in marriage and the forces ranged against independent women by institutions like the church, marriage and the city. Sophia is the wife of Frederick, who has squandered her inherited fortune, which became his legally by marriage, before and abandoning her for his mistress in Paris. Sophia is trapped by gender, class and history. She is deprived of her family estate by the Married Women's Property Act, where women could retain their property rights on marriage. Marxist socialist feminists offer general statements about historical issues, as well as particular and individualized expressions of the effects of historical forces. Patriarchal exploitation and social and sexual estrangements are clear in the passage described. Frederick has cut off all Sophia's credits as well as confiscated her gold and jewels. This is an unforgettable example of patriarchal capitalism, where women had an ambiguous economic status in marriage until the Married Women's Property Act established in 1882, which prevented husbands from forfeiting their wives' property. Women were both men's property and banned from productive relations. The passage depicts control over women as property. Capitalist patriarchy created a commodified domestic woman who is caught between economic possession and sexual exploitation. Towards the end of the novel, the women characters begin to disengage from heterosexual patriarchy as well as capitalist patriarchy. She is able to liberate herself from the patriarchal family through her sensuous relationship with Minna. The symbolic appearance of lesbian desire in the novel is the indication of the deficiencies in patriarchal gender constructions and the need for fresh sexual and social thinking. Let's now recapitulate what we have done so far in this session. Feminisms account for deliberations that intercept various facets of human interaction explicitly highlighted in literature. Though literary texts offer a plethora of interpretations, some themes form the basis of textual plots of the text. Contradictory as well as diverse applications of theory to literary texts offer varied readings into the implications of the texts. Daughter of Earth and Notebook provide insights into second wave feminism by pointing out how social institutions such as marriage, motherhood, fatherhood and individual feelings often clash with personal and inner consciousness. Mari, in Daughter of Earth, realizes that it is important to interrogate confined roles and stereotypical romance to attain freedom from marriage and focus on her individual needs. Lowell, in Notebook, records the need for self-reflection on the process of composition, and his poem depicts patriarchy to be the prime reason for the inability to compromise with his public and private moments. Myths offer ways of reading texts that include metaphoric landscapes, new species and behaviors. Myth criticism often offers psychological interpretations of characters. The left hand of darkness and surfacing provide two different aspects of myth criticism. One, the peep into the future with heterosexuality being challenged, and the other, search for the mythic feminist ethic to provide a suitable way of realizing oneself. Marxist or socialist criticism represents class distinctions and injustices in the society that are based on a fixed and definite social value. Tess, in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, shows Tess' struggle with identity, and her ultimate victory poses a challenge to traditional Marxian ideology. Summer will show details the journey of Sophia, who attains sexual and social freedom in a society that debilitates the role of a woman. We have questions for you which will help you to understand all the 3 sections that we have done so far, until we meet the next session with further deliberations on other theories. Thank you.